Hey guys, tonight we delve into a narrative that many of you, perhaps more than you'd care to admit, might find strangely familiar. Imagine, if you will, a time when your world wasn't just bright, but radiant, bathed in a light so singular and so utterly captivating that every shadow seemed to flee before it. This wasn't just happiness. It was an enveloping warmth, a pervasive golden haze that settled over everything you saw, everything you touched, everything you felt. She was the sun in your sky, the very source of that incredible illumination. And your life, by extension, was a canvas constantly being painted with vibrant, impossible hues. Every shared glance was a spark, every touch a surge, and every word exchanged, even the most mundane, held a secret weight of profound connection. You felt truly seen, truly understood, in a way that defied explanation, as if your very soul had found its mirror. The world, through her eyes, was suddenly sharper, more beautiful, more meaningful. You probably won't survive this story emotionally unscathed. I'm warning you now. This isn't just about a relationship ending. It's about the gradual, often imperceptible erosion of something that once felt like the very foundation of your existence. It's about how the most vivid colors can subtly, slowly, bleed into monochrome, leaving you wondering when the vibrancy departed. Think of it like this. You're standing in a field, bathed in the most glorious sunset you've ever witnessed, the sky aflame with oranges, purples, and golds. You're utterly captivated, lost in its beauty, convinced it will last forever. But then, as all sunsets do, it begins to fade, minute by minute, almost imperceptibly. One moment, it's brilliant. The next, a soft twilight. Then, a deepening blue. And finally, the quiet, star-studded black of night. You didn't see the exact moment the magic left, but you woke up in the dark. That's what we're exploring tonight. This initial phase, this golden haze, wasn't just infatuation. It was a profound sense of rightness, a feeling that the universe had finally aligned. Her presence was a constant, comforting hum in the background of your consciousness, a melody that made every mundane task feel less tedious, every challenge less daunting. You walked through life with an almost tangible lightness, buoyed by the sheer joy of her being. Her laugh was music, her smile a sunrise, and her voice, even when she was just asking about your day, had the power to soothe any anxieties. You built dreams together, spoken as shorthand only you two understood, and envisioned a future so intertwined it seemed impossible to separate. Every memory from that time is steeped in that warm, nostalgic glow, a testament to how deeply she permeated your world. It felt like coming home, a final, definitive arrival after a long, winding journey. This wasn't just love. It was a complete and utter surrender to the intoxicating idea of a shared eternity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. That initial golden haze, however, eventually began to shift, not with a sudden storm, but with the almost imperceptible drift of fine dust motes in a shaft of sunlight. You probably didn't even notice them at first. These tiny, subtle shifts, these almost inaudible whispers of discord. They weren't arguments or dramatic confrontations. They were far more insidious, far more subtle. Think of it like a perfectly tuned instrument, suddenly developing a microscopic flaw in one of its strings. The music still plays, but there's a faint, almost imperceptible buzzing sound, a note that's fractionally off-key. You hear it, but you dismiss it, attributing it to an illusion, a trick of the light, or perhaps just your own imagination. You want the music to be perfect, so you force yourself to believe it still is. These whispers began as tiny inconsistencies, minor deviations from the script you both seemed to be implicitly following. Perhaps it was a fleeting expression on her face, a tightening of her lips that lasted just a second too long, after you'd said something that you thought was innocuous. Or maybe it was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation before she agreed to a plan you were excited about. A pause that lingered in the air like a question mark you weren't allowed to ask. You'd brush it off, of course. She's tired, you'd tell yourself. She's stressed. Everyone has their moments. You were adept at constructing logical, comforting explanations that preserved the illusion of perfect harmony. The shifts also manifested in how you communicated, or rather, how you didn't. Where once conversations flowed effortlessly, a natural exchange of thoughts and feelings, you might have started to notice tiny currents pulling against the stream. Topics that were once open territory now felt slightly fraught, as if stepping on certain words might trigger an unforeseen reaction. You'd find yourself self-censoring, editing your thoughts before speaking, not out of malice or deceit, but out of a subconscious desire to maintain the peace, to avoid that faint, unsettling buzz. It was a subtle dance, an unconscious adaptation to an unacknowledged tension. Then there were the almost imperceptible changes in routines, the small adjustments that, when viewed individually, seemed utterly insignificant. She might start spending a little more time on her phone, not engaging in secretive conversations, but simply being less present. Or perhaps her responses to your questions became slightly shorter, a little less enthusiastic, lacking the vibrant energy that once propelled every interaction. You might try to re-engage, to bring back the old spark, but it felt like pushing against something yielding yet resilient, like trying to catch smoke. You could touch it, but it never quite solidified back into the form you remembered. These weren't red flags waving furiously in the wind. They were tiny, almost transparent threads, barely visible against the backdrop of your love, but slowly, inexorably, beginning to weave themselves into a subtle, almost invisible net. You were still deeply entrenched in the golden haze, still fiercely protective of the perfect image of your relationship. Any anomaly was an aberration, a momentary glitch in the otherwise flawless matrix. You dismissed the whispers, ignored the subtle shifts, and rationalized away the minor inconsistencies, all in an effort to cling to the warmth and light that still, for the most part, enveloped you. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial and hopeful optimism, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of doubt had been planted, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. You told yourself everything was fine, yet a small part of you had begun to listen more closely to the silence between her words. Following those initial whispers of discord, a more profound and unsettling change began to settle in, the fading echoes. This wasn't just about a decrease in shared laughter or easy conversations. It was about those very sounds starting to feel like distant memories, like echoes bouncing off the walls of a cavern you were slowly exploring alone. The vibrancy that once colored every interaction began to leach away, replaced by a muted, almost monochromatic tone. Imagine a vibrant oil painting gradually being covered by a thin film of dust, dulling its brilliance, muting its colors. You could still discern the original image, but its vivacity was undeniably diminished. Where once your conversations flowed with an effortless rhythm, punctuated by genuine amusement and eager anticipation, they now felt structured, like an interview, perhaps, or a formal exchange of information. The spontaneous bursts of shared humor, the inside jokes that needed no explanation, the comfortable silences that spoke volumes, these began to dwindle. You'd find yourself trying to recreate them, perhaps by recounting an old anecdote, only to be met with a polite, almost detached smile, or a perfunctory laugh that didn't quite reach your eyes. It was like trying to catch mist in your hands. The harder you grasped, the more it slipped away. The ease, that beautiful, comforting ease you once shared, started to feel elusive. Remember how you could just be with her. No pretense, no effort, simply existing in a state of mutual understanding? That started to fray. Now, moments together often felt tinged with a subtle pressure, a quiet expectation that you couldn't quite define, but definitely felt. You'd catch yourself searching for the right thing to say, the perfect topic to ignite a spark, only to find the well of shared interests and effortless banter running dry. The conversations became functional, about logistics, about daily tasks, about external events, rarely about the internal landscape of your shared lives, or even your individual ones. It was as if a filter had been placed over your interactions, dampening their intensity, blurring their edges. Even shared activities, once sources of immense joy, began to feel less engaging. A movie night might be spent with both of you engrossed in your phones, occasionally glancing up at the screen, but rarely at each other. Dinners out, which used to be opportunities for lively discussion and intimate connection, might devolve into parallel monologues, each of you talking at the other rather than with them. The shared presence was there physically, but emotionally, you were drifting further and further apart. The comfortable silence had been replaced by an uncomfortable one, a void filled with unspoken thoughts and growing distances. The hardest part was the nostalgia, the way your mind would involuntarily replay snippets of those golden days, contrasting them sharply with the present reality. You'd remember her infectious laugh, echoing through a room, the way she'd lean into you during a quiet moment, the intense look in her eyes when you were discussing something important. These memories became increasingly bittersweet, cherished yet painful, because they served as stark reminders of what was slowly, subtly slipping away. The echoes of those happier times were indeed fading, growing fainter with each passing day, leaving you in a quiet, almost desolate space where once there had been a symphony. You were beginning to sense that the music hadn't just changed. It was slowly dying out. As the echoes of shared laughter and easy conversations continued to fade, a new and far more formidable challenge began to manifest: the slow, silent construction of unseen walls. These weren't overt barriers, built of arguments or explicit disagreements. Instead, they were subtle, transparent partitions, meticulously crafted from unspoken words, unaddressed feelings, and growing emotional distance. Imagine trying to navigate a familiar room where, overnight, invisible panes of glass have been erected, subtly altering pathways, deflecting interactions, and making what was once effortless movement now require conscious effort and careful navigation. You could still see her, still touch her, but there was an imperceptible, yet undeniable, obstruction in the way. These walls were initially constructed from the small, unaddressed moments of disconnect. Perhaps you shared a minor frustration, expecting her usual empathy or an engaging discussion, only to be met with a distracted nod or a quick, generic platitude. You'd internalize that slight disappointment, choosing not to voice it to avoid creating friction. Each unvoiced disappointment, each swallowed complaint, each moment of emotional withdrawal became another brick in that invisible wall. You both, without even realizing it, were complicit in its construction, each choosing silence over potentially uncomfortable honesty. The lack of genuine emotional intimacy became a primary building material, where once you could share your deepest fears and wildest dreams without hesitation, now you found yourself self-editing, offering only superficial versions of your inner world. You might start a sentence intended to reveal vulnerability, only to pull back, sensing a lack of receptive space on her side. Or she might offer a brief glimpse into her own struggles, but quickly retreat if you tried to delve deeper, leaving you feeling like an outsider peering in. The courage to truly open up dwindled, replaced by a cautious guardedness, a protective instinct born from repeated, subtle rebuffs. These unseen walls made simple emotional connection feel strenuous. A comforting hug might feel less like an embrace, and more like two separate bodies briefly occupying the same space. Eye contact, once a conduit for profound understanding, might become fleeting, less direct, almost as if you were both subconsciously avoiding the depth of connection that direct gazes demanded. The ease of physical closeness remained, but the emotional resonance that once accompanied it had dissipated, leaving behind a hollow echo where warmth once resided. You were physically present, but emotionally absent from each other's lives. The most insidious aspect of these walls was their transparency. Because they were unseen, unacknowledged, and built brick by silent brick, they were incredibly difficult to address. How do you confront someone about a barrier they don't even realize they've helped build? How do you articulate a feeling of distance that has no tangible cause? The very act of trying to explain felt like speaking into a void, like trying to grasp smoke. You found yourself increasingly feeling isolated, even when she was physically right beside you. You were in the same room, but functionally, emotionally, you were on different sides of an invisible, unbreachable divide. The warmth of her presence was still physically felt, but her emotional core, once so accessible, now resided behind a series of silent, insurmountable walls. In the quiet aftermath of those unseen walls settling between you, a subtle but significant shift began to emerge in her focus, marking the period when her priorities started to diverge, increasingly excluding your shared life. This wasn't a malicious or deliberate act of abandonment. Rather, it felt like a natural, almost inevitable consequence of the growing emotional distance. Imagine a river that once flowed as a single powerful current, but slowly, over time, a sandbank begins to form in its center. The water still flows, but it now divides into two distinct streams, each carving its own path, gradually moving further apart, even though they originate from the same source. Her attention, which once felt so generously and consistently directed towards you and your mutual world, began to fragment and redirect. New interests emerged, new friendships blossomed, and new goals took precedence, often with an intensity that felt both exciting for her and subtly isolating for you. It wasn't that she stopped caring about you entirely, but rather that her emotional and temporal resources were being increasingly allocated elsewhere. You noticed her spending more time on these new pursuits, talking more animatedly about them, and deriving a palpable sense of energy from them that she no longer seemed to find in your shared existence. The conversations you did have increasingly revolved around these emerging priorities. You would listen, of course, offering support and interest, but there was a growing sense of being an observer rather than a participant. It was like she was sharing dispatches from a fascinating new country she was exploring, a place you were not invited to visit. Her eyes would light up when discussing these new ventures, a sparkle you hadn't seen directed at your shared life in quite some time. This wasn't a criticism of her growth, but a painful observation of its direction, away from you. Practical manifestations of this shift were also evident. Plans that once involved both of you might now subtly morph to accommodate her new commitments, sometimes leaving you feeling like an afterthought. Decisions about your shared future, once a collaborative process, might be presented to you as nearly complete, with her having already invested significant emotional and practical energy into them before consulting you. It wasn't about control. It was about a fundamental reorientation of her compass, with your shared life no longer at its magnetic north. You tried at times to bridge the gap, to show interest in these new areas of her life, to find common ground within them. But it often felt forced, like you were trying to cram yourself into spaces that weren't designed for you. The effortless synergy you once shared in pursuing common goals had been replaced by a quiet effort on your part to simply stay abreast of her evolving world. The painful truth was that while her world was expanding, your shared world was contracting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, leaving you feeling less and less central to her narrative. The sandbank in the river was growing larger, and the two streams were now flowing with increasing independence, each carving a deeper channel further away from the other. You were still in the water, but the current was carrying her further downstream than you. With her priorities increasingly diverging and the unseen walls growing taller, you inevitably entered a period characterized by the loss of a silent language. This wasn't merely about verbal communication becoming strained. It was the erosion of that profound, intuitive understanding that once transcended words, the unspoken connection that allowed you to read each other's moods, anticipate needs, and communicate complex emotions with a mere glance or a subtle gesture. Imagine two musicians who once played in perfect, intuitive harmony, able to improvise and respond to each other's nuances without needing a single spoken cue. Now, however, that unspoken synchronicity has vanished, leaving them playing separate, disjointed melodies. This silent language was built on a foundation of shared history, deep empathy, and an almost psychic attunement. You knew what her furrowed brow meant without her having to explain. You understood the subtle shift in her posture that indicated discomfort or joy. A gentle squeeze of your hand could convey reassurance, apology, or affection, needing no verbal reinforcement. These were the countless tiny, non-verbal cues that stitched the fabric of your connection together, making it rich and intricate. Now, those threads were beginning to unravel, one by one. The first signs of this loss were often confusing. You might offer a gesture of comfort, expecting her usual receptive response, only to find it met with a blank look, as if the meaning had been lost in translation. Or you might express a need non-verbally, through a sigh or a particular stance, and realize she no longer picked up on it, leaving you feeling unheard and unseen despite your best efforts. It was like speaking in a dialect that only one of you could still comprehend, while the other had forgotten its nuances. The absence of this silent language made interactions feel strangely clumsy. You had to articulate everything explicitly, painstakingly putting into words what once flowed effortlessly between you. This process often felt reductive, stripping emotions of their richness and subtlety. What could once be conveyed with a knowing look now required a lengthy explanation. And even then, the true depth of feeling often failed to translate. This made you both feel more guarded, less spontaneous, and ultimately, more alone in your own heads. The intuition that once guided your interactions also faded, where once you instinctively knew how to support her, how to cheer her up, or when to give her space. Now you felt like you were constantly guessing. Your attempts to connect, once so natural and effective, might now miss the mark entirely, leading to frustration for both of you. It was a disheartening realization. The inherent understanding, the deep-seated empathy that made your bond so special, was no longer a reliable compass. You were navigating blind, and the terrain felt increasingly unfamiliar. The music had not only become disjointed, the instruments themselves seemed to be speaking different dialects, incapable of truly harmonizing anymore. The silence between you grew heavier, no longer comfortable, but filled with the deafening sound of a once shared language slowly, irreversibly, dying out. As the silent language between you dissipated, and her priorities continued to pull her further away, an increasingly heavy and pervasive burden began to settle over your relationship, the weight of expectation. This wasn't just about unmet needs. It was about the accumulation of unspoken needs and unaddressed disappointments, festering beneath the surface like uncleaned wounds. Imagine carrying a backpack, initially light, but into which, every day, someone secretly places a small, heavy stone. You don't feel the weight of each individual stone, but over time, the pack becomes an unbearable burden. Its contents a mystery you're afraid to unpack. These expectations were often born from the memory of how things used to be. You expected her to understand you without words, because she once did. You expected her to prioritize your shared time, because there was a period when nothing else seemed more important. You expected emotional reciprocity, because it was once a natural and abundant flow. When these expectations weren't met, which became increasingly frequent, they didn't always manifest as overt anger or resentment. More often, they manifested as a quiet, internal disappointment, a sinking feeling that you quickly learned to suppress. The reason these disappointments became so heavy was precisely because they remained unaddressed. You both, perhaps out of a fear of conflict, or a subconscious desire to preserve the dwindling peace, avoided confronting the growing chasm between expectation and reality. You hoped she would eventually notice, that she would revert to the person you remembered, that the missing pieces would simply reappear. This hope, however, only served to amplify the disappointment when they didn't. Each ignored expectation became a silent wound, and as these wounds accumulated, they began to drain the life force from the relationship. This unspoken burden also created a subtle tension in your interactions. Every time you initiated a conversation or a shared activity, there was an underlying layer of hope, an almost desperate wish that this time it would be like it used to be. And every time it wasn't, the disappointment added another stone to your metaphorical backpack. You began to enter interactions with a preemptive sense of defeat, expecting less and less, yet still carrying the weight of what you wished you could expect. For her part, she likely felt a different kind of pressure, perhaps the unspoken expectation to be something she no longer was, or to fulfill needs she no longer recognized or felt capable of meeting. The unspoken nature of these burdens meant there was no opportunity for discussion, no chance for resolution. The air between you became thick with unexpressed desires, unvented frustrations, and a pervasive sense of being misunderstood. The silence, once comfortable, was now suffocating, filled with the heavy, unacknowledged load you both were carrying. You were walking on eggshells, not because of imminent danger, but because the ground beneath you was composed entirely of fragile, unaddressed emotions. The backpack was getting heavier, and the journey ahead seemed impossibly long. Under the increasing weight of unspoken expectations and unaddressed disappointments, the trajectory of your lives began to reveal a stark and painful truth. Your parallel paths were diverging. This wasn't merely about individual growth or personal development. It was the realization that your respective journeys, once so intimately intertwined and seemingly destined to run side by side forever, were now unmistakably moving apart. Imagine two railway tracks laid perfectly parallel for miles, carrying trains in the same direction to the same destination. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, one track begins to curve outwards, ever so slightly, while the other continues straight. The distance between them grows, slowly but relentlessly, until they are on entirely different courses, heading towards different horizons. This divergence became evident in countless small ways, reflecting the earlier shifts in her priorities and the loss of your silent language. You found yourselves developing different sets of friends, pursuing separate hobbies with increasing fervor, and finding joy and fulfillment in activities that no longer included the other. Where once your social circles were largely merged, they now became distinct, with separate inside jokes, shared histories, and loyalties. You would hear about her adventures and new connections secondhand, or she would hear about yours, making both of you feel like distant acquaintances catching up rather than intimate partners. The vision of a shared future, once so clear and compelling, also began to blur. Your conversations about us and our future became less frequent, less detailed, and often tinged with an unspoken uncertainty. When such topics did arise, you might discover fundamental differences in your long-term goals, your ideal lifestyles, or even your core values, differences that had been dormant or easily reconciled in the earlier, more unified phase of your relationship. Now, these differences felt significant, almost insurmountable, pulling you in opposite directions. This wasn't a conscious decision by either of you to sever ties. It was a natural consequence of the slow erosion of shared ground. As you both evolved, you evolved along increasingly separate vectors. Your personal growth, once a force that strengthened your bond, now subtly contributed to its weakening, as each step forward on your individual paths seemed to take you further from the other. The things that excited her no longer excited you in the same way, and vice versa. Your enthusiasm for life, once channeled into shared experiences, now found different outlets, creating separate wells of joy and contentment. The most poignant aspect of this divergence was the growing sense of loneliness within the relationship. You were still technically together, still shared a history, and perhaps even a home, but the emotional connection that tethered your paths together had stretched taut and was now snapping in places. You looked across at her, sometimes, and saw a person you loved, yes, but also a person whose trajectory was clearly, undeniably taking her away from yours. The tracks were no longer parallel. They were on diverging courses, and the realization was a quiet, heartbreaking acknowledgement that you were no longer heading to the same destination. As the realization of your diverging paths settled in, a new corrosive element began to infiltrate the very fabric of your relationship. Resentment's slow burn. This wasn't an explosive, fiery anger, but rather a quiet, internal buildup of unaddressed grievances, overlooked efforts, and unfulfilled needs that smoldered beneath the surface, slowly poisoning the atmosphere between you. Imagine a beautiful, intricately crafted wooden structure that, unbeknownst to its inhabitants, has a tiny, almost invisible ember glowing deep within its foundations. It doesn't burst into flames, but instead, slowly, silently, burns away at the wood, weakening the structure from the inside out, until one day, the entire edifice is compromised. This resentment stemmed from the countless small slights and perceived injustices that had accumulated over time, each one a tiny chip against the pedestal you had once placed her on, and by extension, your relationship. It might have been the consistent feeling of your needs being secondary to her new priorities, or the unspoken frustration of always being the one to compromise. Perhaps it was the sting of an unacknowledged effort you made, or the quiet hurt of feeling consistently misunderstood, even after trying to explicitly articulate your feelings. Each instance on its own seemed too trivial to address, too petty to voice, yet each one left an indelible mark. The insidious nature of this slow burn was its silence. Because these grievances were largely unvoiced, they festered. You would replay scenarios in your mind, re-evaluating her actions through a lens of growing cynicism, finding fault where you once found understanding. Your internal monologue became a constant low hum of, why didn't she ... double quotes. She never ... double quotes. I always ... This internal dialogue, though silent to her, created a significant emotional barrier, further insulating you from genuine connection. The very act of constantly re-evaluating and internally criticizing her chipped away at your affection, replacing it with a quiet, persistent irritation. Resentment also manifested in a subtle reluctance to engage, a subconscious pulling back of your emotional energy. Why expend effort, you might subconsciously ask yourself, if it's likely to be unappreciated or simply overlooked? This led to a vicious cycle. You withdrew due to resentment, which in turn could be perceived by her as a lack of care, potentially fueling her own unspoken grievances. The gap between you widened, not with dramatic arguments, but with the quiet withdrawal of goodwill and emotional investment. The weight of these unspoken grievances began to color your perception of her entirely. You started to notice her flaws more acutely, to interpret her innocent actions through a more negative lens, to find irritation in habits that once seemed endearing or simply neutral. The image of the person you fell in love with began to be overshadowed by the accumulated shadows of disappointment and frustration. The slow burn of resentment was not only destroying your feelings for her, but was also distorting your very memory of her. The wooden structure, once so grand and robust, was now silently hollowed out, its eventual collapse not a question of if, but when. With resentment's slow burn steadily eroding the foundations of your relationship, it became inevitable that the subtle, invisible damage would eventually give way to visible manifestations. The cracks appeared. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic break, but rather the point where the once solid structure of your connection, weakened by unseen forces, began to show undeniable fissures. Imagine a beautiful, ancient ceramic vase, passed down through generations. For years, it holds its form, its glaze unbroken, but beneath the surface, tiny hairline fractures have been forming from stress. Then one day, those internal fissures finally reach the surface, becoming visible to the naked eye. Delicate spiderweb patterns that once glimpsed cannot be unseen. These cracks manifested in various ways, often in moments of pressure or vulnerability. Where once you could weather minor disagreements with ease, now even trivial issues could escalate quickly, revealing an underlying fragility in your interactions. A difference of opinion might no longer be a discussion to be resolved, but a battleground where past grievances, fueled by resentment, could be subtly weaponized. The fair fights of earlier days were replaced by exchanges that felt loaded, where every word carried the weight of unspoken history and unresolved pain. One of the most disheartening cracks was the deterioration of trust, not necessarily in fidelity, but in the belief that she would consistently have your back, that she would be your unwavering champion. You might find yourself questioning her motives, second-guessing her intentions, or feeling a lack of support in crucial moments where you once felt utterly secure. This wasn't outright betrayal, but a creeping doubt, a sense that the rock you relied on had become porous and unreliable. This particular crack was agonizing because it struck at the very core of partnership. The emotional distance, previously unseen and unacknowledged, now became painfully obvious. There were moments when you would look at her, truly look, and feel an overwhelming sense of separation, as if she were a stranger you vaguely knew. The warmth that once emanated from her presence seemed to have receded, replaced by a cool, almost indifferent aura. These were the moments when the invisible walls became almost tangible, their presence undeniable. You could see the distance, feel the chasm, and the realization hit you with a dull ache. Even the simplest acts of affection might feel forced or hollow. A kiss might lack passion. A hug might feel routine rather than intimate. A shared touch might no longer electrify. It was as if the emotional current that once flowed so freely between you had been severely diminished, barely a trickle where there was once a torrent. The movements were there, the physical gestures, but the underlying emotional resonance was largely absent, leaving behind a stark, uncomfortable emptiness. The vase was undeniably cracked, its integrity compromised, and the beautiful patterns that once adorned it were now overshadowed by the delicate yet devastating lines of fracture. The illusion of an unbroken whole had finally shattered. As the cracks became undeniably visible, revealing the fragile state of your connection, a natural, almost subconscious survival mechanism kicked in, seeking solace elsewhere. This wasn't necessarily about seeking another romantic partner, though for some, that might eventually become a part of the narrative. More broadly, it was about finding comfort, understanding, and validation in spaces and with people outside the increasingly strained confines of your relationship. Imagine a parched traveler in a desert, desperately searching for an oasis. If their primary well has run dry, they will instinctively seek water elsewhere, not out of disloyalty to the well, but out of a fundamental need for sustenance. You began to gravitate towards friends, family, or even new acquaintances who offered the emotional nourishment that was increasingly absent at home. Conversations with these external sources felt lighter, more engaging, and less burdened by the unspoken history that weighed down your interactions with her. You found yourself confiding in others, sharing your thoughts, feelings, and even your frustrations about the relationship, something you once reserved exclusively for her. This external validation, however temporary, provided a much-needed respite from the emotional drought you were experiencing. Hobbies and personal interests, once shared or at least mutually supported, became individual sanctuaries. You poured more energy into your work, into creative pursuits, into fitness, or into intellectual endeavors. These activities offered a sense of accomplishment, purpose, and a much-needed distraction from the emotional void that had grown between you. They became spaces where you could feel truly engaged, truly alive, without the constant undercurrent of disappointment or the heavy weight of unfulfilled expectations. The comfort found elsewhere was a quiet, almost guilt-ridden relief. You knew deep down that seeking such profound emotional solace outside the relationship was a clear indicator of its decline. Yet, the alternative remaining in the parched landscape of your diminishing connection felt unsustainable. You were thirsty, and you were finding water wherever you could, even if it meant venturing further and further from the source that once sustained you entirely. It was a testament to your innate need for connection and emotional well-being, a need that was no longer being adequately met within the confines of your partnership. This period was characterized by a subtle yet pervasive sense of duality. You maintained the outward appearance of a functional relationship, going through the motions, fulfilling obligations, but internally, your emotional life was increasingly being lived on parallel tracks. Your true feelings, your deepest vulnerabilities, your genuine joys, and your most profound sorrows were now shared with others, or kept entirely to yourself. The emotional core of your existence had shifted, slowly but surely, away from her and towards these alternative sources of comfort. The oasis you desperately sought was not within the desert of your relationship, but somewhere beyond its barren expanse, and you were compelled to find it. As you increasingly sought solace elsewhere, the cumulative weight of all the preceding shifts, the fading echoes, the unseen walls, the diverging paths, the slow burn of resentment, and the visible cracks culminated in a profound and irreversible moment. The illusion shatters. This wasn't necessarily a single traumatic event, but rather the point where the idealized version of her, and more importantly, the idealized version of your life together, broke irrevocably. Imagine a meticulously crafted stained glass window, beautiful and vibrant, depicting a perfect scene. For years, you've admired its artistry, its seamless colors. Then, one day, a hairline fracture, previously hidden, finally gives way, and the entire panel shatters into countless pieces. The beauty is still there, in the fragments, but the cohesive, perfect image is gone forever. This shattering often happened in moments of stark clarity, sometimes triggered by a seemingly minor incident. Perhaps it was a mundane argument where, for the first time, you saw her not as the woman you loved, but as a source of frustration and indifference. Or it might have been a quiet evening when, despite her physical presence, you felt an overwhelming sense of emotional solitude, realizing that the person beside you was no longer the one who understood your soul. The veil of hopeful denial, which you had unconsciously woven around your perception of the relationship, was finally torn away. The hardest part of this shattering was confronting the cognitive dissonance between the her you remembered and the her she had become, or perhaps the her she always was, now seen without the rose-tinted glasses of initial love. You realized that the future you had so meticulously envisioned, the one filled with golden light and effortless harmony, was no longer attainable with this person, in this reality. The dream was over, replaced by a stark and often painful apprehension of the present. This wasn't just about disappointment. It was about the profound loss of a shared narrative, a shared fantasy. You had invested so much of your identity, your hopes, and your future into this relationship. And now that central pillar had crumbled. The fragments left behind were real, often beautiful memories, but they no longer formed a coherent whole. The picture was broken, and there was no way to put it back together exactly as it was. The illusion shattering was also about acknowledging your own complicity in maintaining it. You had, for a long time, actively chosen to overlook the whispers of discord, to rationalize the fading echoes, and to deny the unseen walls. You had clung to the idea of us even as us became increasingly fractured. This realization brought with it a complex mix of regret, self-reproach, and a strange sense of liberation. The truth, however painful, was finally undeniable. You no longer had to expend emotional energy maintaining a facade, no longer had to pretend that the stained glass window was whole. The pieces were scattered, and in their stark reality, you could finally begin to see a path forward, albeit one entirely different from the glorious vision that had once captivated you. The beautiful lie had ended, leaving behind the hard, sharp edges of reality. With the illusion irrevocably shattered, Leaving behind the stark fragments of reality, you were propelled into a period of painful reckoning. This wasn't merely about understanding the emotional distance that had grown between you. It was the unavoidable confrontation with the truth of your relationship's impending end. Imagine a ship, once magnificent and robust, now listing heavily, its hull visibly compromised, taking on water. For a long time, the crew might have tried to deny the severity, to patch the leaks, to maintain the illusion of seaworthiness. But eventually, a point is reached where the truth is undeniable. The ship is sinking, and a decision must be made about how to proceed. This reckoning was characterized by an intense, often agonizing process of reevaluating everything. Every past memory, every shared experience, every promise made was viewed through the lens of this new, harsh reality. You meticulously dissected the timeline of your love, trying to pinpoint where exactly the current had shifted, where the unseen walls had begun to rise, where the first cracks had formed. It was a forensic examination of your own heart, painful in its detail, but necessary to truly grasp the extent of the damage. The emotional toll of this reckoning was immense. There was profound sadness for the loss of what you once had, for the future you had so eagerly anticipated, and for the person you once believed she was, or could be, with you. There was also anger at yourself for perhaps not seeing the signs sooner, or for not addressing them more directly. Anger at her for contributing to the decline, for the emotional withdrawal, for the pain she had, perhaps unintentionally, inflicted. These emotions swirled within you, a turbulent storm of grief and frustration. This period also involved a confrontation with your own role in the decline. While it might be tempting to assign blame solely to her, a true reckoning demands introspection. You had to acknowledge where you had been complacent, where you had failed to communicate, where you had allowed resentment to fester instead of addressing it. This self-reflection was crucial, not for self-flagellation, but for understanding and growth, to ensure that you learn from the painful lessons of this dissolving connection. The hardest part of this reckoning was accepting the inevitability of the end. For so long, you had fought against it, clung to hope, tried to mend the unfixable. Now, with the illusion gone, you saw with chilling clarity that the relationship, as you knew it, was beyond repair. It was a broken thing, and holding on to it, trying to force it back into shape, would only prolong the suffering for both of you. The ship was sinking, and the painful reckoning was the decision to abandon it, to save yourself, even if it meant swimming alone into an uncertain sea. It was the moment you stopped fighting for a future that no longer existed and began, however reluctantly, to prepare for a future without her. After the painful reckoning, when the inevitability of the end became undeniably clear, you entered a phase that, paradoxically, often precedes any physical separation, the quiet departure. This wasn't about packing bags or saying goodbyes. It was the subtle, internal severing of emotional ties, a gradual unhooking of your heart from hers, long before any explicit declaration of a breakup. Imagine a tethered balloon, once held firmly by numerous ropes. As each rope frays and snaps, one by one, the balloon doesn't immediately fly away, but its connection to the ground becomes increasingly tenuous. Its ascent a quiet certainty, even before the last rope is cut. This quiet departure was characterized by a profound shift in your emotional investment. Where once your feelings for her consumed a significant portion of your mental and emotional landscape, now that space began to recede, to quieten. The intense emotional reactions, the joy, the hurt, the frustration, started to lessen in their intensity. You still felt things, of course, but they no longer pierced you with the same sharpness. It was a gradual numbing, a protective mechanism allowing you to detach without the immediate agony of a clean break. You found yourself consciously or subconsciously withdrawing emotional energy. You stopped fighting battles you knew were unwinnable, stopped trying to bridge gaps that felt too wide, stopped holding on to hopes that you now knew were futile. This withdrawal wasn't done out of spite or anger, but out of a deep-seated need for self-preservation. You were no longer trying to fix the relationship. You were quietly extracting yourself from its wreckage. The quiet aspect of this departure was key. It happened largely within you, a private process of emotional reorientation. Outwardly, things might have remained much the same for a time. You might still share meals, still engage in routine conversations, still occupy the same space. But internally, the emotional connection was steadily being severed. You were learning to live without her, even when she was still physically present. You were practicing being emotionally independent, rehearsing for a future where her presence held no sway over your happiness or despair. This internal severing also involved a kind of grief, a quiet mourning for the living loss. You were grieving the absence of a future that would never come to pass, the death of a dream, and the fading of a love that once defined you. It was a melancholy process, tinged with sadness, but also with a nascent sense of liberation. Each snapped emotional tether, while causing a pang of loss, also allowed you to feel a little lighter, a little freer, a little more capable of independent flight. The balloon was slowly, silently, preparing for its ultimate release, drifting upwards even as the final ropes remained, for a little while longer, attached to the ground. After the quiet departure, after the internal severing of ties had allowed your emotional balloon to drift free, you finally reached a place of embracing the void. This wasn't an empty or desolate state, as the word void might initially suggest. Rather, it was a surprisingly peaceful space, a newfound sense of calm and clarity in the absence of her defining presence. Imagine a vast, open landscape after a tumultuous storm has finally passed. The sky is clear, the air is still, and while the evidence of the storm's fury might remain in the altered terrain, there is a profound quietude, an expansive emptiness that feels not like loss, but like possibility. This void was the space created by her absence, both physical and emotional. It was initially disorienting, perhaps even frightening, to no longer have her as the central organizing principle of your life. For so long, your days had been structured around her, your identity intertwined with hers. Now, that structure was gone, and you were left with a blank canvas, an unwritten page. But rather than feeling lost, you began to experience a nascent sense of liberation, a quiet joy in the freedom to redefine yourself without external influence. In this void, you rediscovered your own voice, your own desires, your own internal compass. The constant emotional negotiation, the subtle self-censorship, the effort to maintain a fractured connection, all of these demands had vanished. The mental and emotional energy that was once consumed by the relationship was now liberated, available to be reinvested in yourself. You started to listen to your own needs, to pursue your own passions without compromise, to truly understand who you were, independent of her. The peace in this void stemmed from the absence of conflict, the absence of expectation, the absence of the constant effort required to sustain something that was no longer viable. The weight you had been carrying, the burden of unspoken needs and unaddressed disappointments, had finally been lifted. The air felt lighter, your steps felt surer, and the constant hum of underlying tension had been replaced by a quiet, internal stillness. This embrace of the void was also an acceptance of solitude, not as loneliness, but as a fertile ground for self-discovery. You learned to enjoy your own company, to find contentment in your own thoughts, to become your own best companion. The fear of being alone, which might have haunted you earlier, dissipated as you realized that true connection begins with a strong connection to yourself. The landscape after the storm was indeed altered, perhaps irrevocably so, but in its vast, open emptiness, you found not desolation, but the quiet promise of new beginnings, the space for new growth, and the profound, surprising peace of simply being unburdened and free. The silence was no longer heavy. It was expansive, a canvas awaiting your own vibrant colors. And so, as the moon begins its slow, silent journey across the velvet sky, casting long, gentle shadows we arrive at the end of our story. Tonight, we've walked through the golden haze of a beginning, felt the subtle shifts, navigated the unseen walls, and ultimately found peace in the quiet aftermath of a love that transformed, then faded. Remember, every ending holds a new beginning, a space for growth, for understanding, and for rediscovering the strength within yourself. The void is not emptiness. It's possibility. May your dreams be gentle, your mind be clear, and your heart find solace in the quiet unfolding of your own unique path. Trust the journey, trust yourself. The end, sweet dreams.